Welcome to the Health Wealth Podcast and Radio Show with Forbes author and contributor Dr. Josh Luke, America's Healthcare Affordability Authority. Visit drjoshluke.com for information on speaking appearances and other resources.
I did, yeah. That was just one of the most well-respected, kind of what I would call traditional book PR firms, and one of the things that happened during the course of my time at that company. If you think about it, 2004 to 2010, the media landscape shifted dramatically during that time. And so one of the things that I recognized I felt like there was an opportunity for an agency that brought PR, digital marketing, website design and development, graphic design, all under one roof, as opposed to hiring a bunch of different vendors for that. So that was the initial model for Shelton Interactive.
And so what was your major at Texas?
Corporate communication.
Awesome. Yeah, awesome. So, as I've made this journey to meet one of the neat things about social media is actually putting a name with a face and getting to meet people that you've dialogued with for a couple of years. And I'm getting to a lot more of that with this Masters of LinkedIn Summit coming up. But what I found is a lot of the folks studied journalism and public relations and corporate communications in college, as you and I both did. And it really, I always joke with people, and I teach at the University of Southern California, but I'm in healthcare policy department, and I've been talking to the journalism school about teaching, and I'm just curious to see if there's anything they teach that's the same that they taught before the millennium. Because when I learned public relations, so much of what we do nowadays was thought to be unethical, or you can't promote yourself, or there was no social media. It was all about reporters and relationships, which gets back to your training and a lot of your philosophy, which we're going to cover here in a minute. So tell us, so you went out on your own, and you founded a business, and tell us how many employees it grew to. And this show is really about healthcare affordability. So
Sure.
Tell us about how you approach that, particularly as a young entrepreneur who hadn't had years and years of experience with healthcare to really understand what you should be doing and what priorities were. So tell us about that journey as an entrepreneur.
Oh man, I got a crash course in healthcare after starting the agency. So when I started, my wife was a nurse actually. So I had a little bit of background in the healthcare space, just kind of watching her journey as a mother-baby nurse. But when I started the company in 2010, she was staying home. We had 2 kids at home in diapers, and not a whole lot of money in the bank. So it wasn't like I was starting, this agency with millions of dollars in funding or with some war chest of financing in place. And so when I started it out, we grew those first couple of years slowly, and then we really hit a nice growth curve, and we're able to make the Fast 50 of fastest growing companies here in Central Texas, and grew up to 18 employees. And so when I first started the agency, the initial focus was, all right, well, I got to figure out a way to pay for my family, in our healthcare, and make enough each month to do that. And as I was bringing on team members, one of the great things about being in the PR space is a lot of our workforce is young, is pretty healthy. And so, my hope was that was going to be something that would help us to keep healthcare costs down. But man, it's amazing. So my focus there, we covered 50%. So Shelton Interactive covered 50% of our team members' healthcare costs, and then they would cover the other 50% from there. And it was one of those things where I wanted to make as much of a contribution as I possibly could to make it easy on them. But I remember thinking the price per person at 50% felt like I was paying 100% or 150%, especially towards the end. Oh my gosh. So, and it's just gotten worse, unfortunately.
Yeah. And that's really what the whole motivation behind Health-Wealth is. And I think most of you know you can find all the information on the books and the podcast and anything you want to know, the loss assessment at health-wealth.com. And really, that's what this series of books and sessions is about. It's about how can we make healthcare affordable. And we've talked about this before, but really in D.C., whether it was Obama, Trump, Hillary, it didn't matter. They're not talking about bringing your costs down. They're talking about who's going to pay for it, the individual or the taxpayer or corporate America. And it's going to be a little of everybody until we really start to bring costs down. So I think that's a great position. So Rusty, are you a Gen Xer? Are you a millennial? Are you an Xennial, as they say?
I'm right on that line. So 1981, and some of the charts I'm Gen X, and some of the charts I'm year 1 of Gen Y. So I like to claim them both. I just claim the best of each one.
Yeah, there you go. So they use the term Xennial from time to time. You get to pick which one you like. I'll vote for Gen Xers, but I'm a big fan of of millennials as well. So, when Forbes Books had recruited me to write a book on healthcare affordability, after I signed the deal, we shook hands, and Justin Batt, who is one of their senior executives, handed me Rusty's book, and he said, "Hey, this is one of my colleagues. He wrote this book, Mastering the New Media Landscape, with a colleague of his, Barbara Cave Henricks." And kind of describe owned versus media.
Sure, absolutely. So in today's media landscape, Josh, we've got three categories of media. So we've got rented media, we've got earned media, and we have owned media. When you and I were coming up, there were really only two categories of media. There was rented media, so buying an ad, or there was earned media, earning your way into the newspaper or on radio, TV, et cetera. But to get a message out at scale, as recently as 10 years ago, you really had to go through the media. And one of the biggest changes that's happened in the media landscape ever has been the total flattening of distribution. In other words, the things like this podcast that give you a chance to go around the media and go directly to your audience in a really authentic way. And so what we have found is that in kind of thinking about a media strategy, success today is really thinking more like a media outlet than a marketer. So in other words, the goal that you have is not impressions to immediate conversions. The goal that you've got as somebody who wants to get a message out, make an impact on the world, grow your business, is actually looking to establish the exact same relationship that the New York Times has with its audience, or that NPR has with its audience, which is providing entertaining and informative content that really extends your interaction with them. And so, as you referenced, rented media includes all of the platforms where you've got full control over the message, but somebody else owns the real estate. So it's your LinkedIn account, it's your Facebook page, it's your Twitter account. Advertising efforts also live there. And a lot of people, Josh, will focus on building a huge audience on LinkedIn or on Facebook, and will be content to leave that audience on Facebook or on LinkedIn. And the challenge or the risk factor there is that when you leave your audience on real estate that somebody else owns, you're totally beholden to their algorithm in terms of your ability to get to that audience. So what we've seen through the years is that the longer you leave an audience on real estate somebody else owns, the more beholden you are to their willingness to let you get to that audience. And so the big thing for us, whether you're giving an interview with NPR, or you're building an audience on Facebook, or you're giving an interview on somebody else's podcast, is always, number one, give great content. So make a great impression, give value. Number two, how do you siphon off as much of that audience as possible? In other words, how do you give as many people as possible a reason to head over to drjoshluke.com, take that free assessment, get value, but get into an environment with that email list where you fully own the connection to them in the same way that a media outlet owns that connection to their subscriber base.
I love that description. And Rusty, oftentimes he'll do a diagram that shows the stadium. Can you tell a little bit about the stadium diagram?
Yeah, for sure. So the way I encourage people to think about their owned media audience is imagine just a 360 stadium. Okay, so imagine normal football stadium. We'll stick with the Longhorns for a second. So we'll go with the DKR here in Austin. So if you think about your owned media audience, imagine in the middle of that stadium we've got a curtain going right down the middle, dividing it in half, and there's a stage in the middle there. So every single person listening to this podcast today has three audiences. Okay? Audience one is what I think of as the backstage audience. So audience one is that group of people that have already decided to spend money with you. Okay, they're your existing customer base, they're your strategic partners, et cetera, and they're getting a backstage VIP experience. On the other side of the curtain, audience two, this is your email list. So this is everybody that you own the connection to, but that you don't yet have spending money with you. In other words, they have not shifted over to that other side. They've not decided yet they want to buy something from you. Audience three is outside the stadium. So audience three is everybody that, as we sit here today, everybody who could benefit from what you offer or from your message, but who has no idea who you are. Most people build marketing campaigns, Josh, to reach as many people as possible who have never heard of them before. So in other words, as many people as they can in audience three, and they try to immediately convert them to audience one. So in other words, you're trying to move somebody from having never heard of you before to buying something immediately, and it's a huge jump to make. I mean, honestly, that approach is where marketing and advertising budgets go to die. So you're converting such a small percentage of people. So the shift that I want to encourage people to make is really think about, instead of trying to move somebody from 3 to 1, move somebody from 3 to 2. In other words, move them from having never heard of you before to giving them value. In other words, giving them a reason to take a seat in your auditorium by joining your email list. And so the last thing I'll add there is just the way I want to encourage your audience to think about this is, when somebody lands on your website, it's kind of like they're walking in the back door of that stadium and they're peering down from the rafters. They're trying to make a decision. Is there anything for me to do here? When you've got a website that's set up like an online brochure, in other words, the only thing for me to do on that website is buy something, then that's really only set up for me to walk all the way down to the stage from the rafters, money in hand, immediately, which is such a huge jump. So in other words, you may be driving huge traffic to that website. You could have the best PR campaign ever, but if you're driving tons of traffic to that website and you don't have a lead magnet, you don't have a call to action that gives people a reason to take a seat, it's just a revolving door there, and you're missing a huge amount of value.
Great point. And so Rusty and I had the opportunity at the Authority Summit to spend some time on stage talking about LinkedIn hacks. And I remember he put my profile up so the entire audience could see it, and we went through why the spacing is the way it is, and why I chose the titles I chose, and how I wasn't repetitive as in PR we used to call it above the fold, right? Back when there were newspapers.
Sure.
And so I still tell my millennial friends that are all programmers, and they all scratch their head till they get to know me. Look, I want above the fold. I want you to see all this without having to scroll down. I don't know if there's a term for that or not, but it's like homepage without scrolling. It all needs to be there. And I love how Rusty described it, as it can't just be a sales pitch. And the one thing I said to Rusty before we went on stage, I said, you're gonna hear these words from me on almost every answer about LinkedIn, which is you need to bring relevant business content in everything you do. And one of the things I loved about Rusty's book is he really clearly outlined the benefits of each social media platform. He outlined what percentage of posts should be business versus promotional versus personal, all these different things, and why they were all relevant in their own way. But what I also heard for the first time in Rusty's book is something that, the folks at Forbes Media later told me, hey, you're great at these things. I just never knew they were called short form versus long form. And so what I've learned that I think is one of the best things people can hear that want to grow on Twitter or LinkedIn or another social platform, I get more mileage and growth out of reposting an article Rusty might have written or shared and adding my witty 2 or 3 sentences of what I think of it, or interpreting it for my audience, because I have a narrow lane. I guess it's not so narrow anymore, but I emerged through a narrow lane in healthcare. And then as I garnered a lot more followers and people who had an interest in my message, it expanded to healthcare affordability. So no matter what article I see, I will make a comment and share it, and make a comment that I think is relevant to my audience. And what I will tell you is I travel the country and speak. When I get pulled aside at events when people might recognize me, that's one of the #1 comments I get. I love on LinkedIn when you just give me 2 or 3 sentences of what you think this story really means, whether you're saying, yes, this is great, or hey, read between the lines on this, or this is just PR and fluff, don't buy into it. These guys are sinking so fast you don't know how long they'll be around. So talk a little bit about social media growth between short form, long form, and now of course video.
Yeah. Well, I think the key point you made there to me, Josh, and the reason, I think one of the reasons that you've been as successful as you have is you've had a mindset that really is thinking more like the media than a marketer. In other words, so many people that are trying to build an audience online, make an impact, they think it's the me first show. In other words, they get on their stage and they're only given their own content. And if you're just starting to build a brand or just starting to build a platform, the reality is that, number one, your audience is not yet big enough to know to pay attention to just your stuff. Number two, nobody really wants to pay attention to somebody that's got a me first agenda. And so success today, again, thinking more like the media than a marketer, what that means is really being a curator in your space. So yeah, part of that is giving great content and giving great value from your own perspective. But another big part of that is showcasing and giving a platform to other people, sharing the right articles, interviewing the right people. And going back to the stadium analogy, when you share somebody else's content or when you interview somebody else, it's kind of like you're inviting them up on your stage in your auditorium. And when you do that, they bring their audience with them when they share it. Number two, when you do that, you also build typically affinity and goodwill with that person that you interview. And so one of the things I want to encourage your followers to think a little bit about is, as they are looking to build an audience, the best way to do that is not to focus only on their own content. It's really to be within their space, the media personality that is providing context and spotlights on the stuff they need to be paying attention to.
Great example. This morning, I get Modern Healthcare, Becker's, all these different daily publications that keep me in the loop on what a hospital CEO needs to be aware of. The lead article on Modern Healthcare this morning is employers are going direct to health systems. They're skipping the insurer because they found that their influence is more powerful than the insurers, particularly in communities where they have significant influence as maybe the only provider, the largest provider. This is a perfect example of health wealth. And so what I do and how I grew through short form. So my goal, once LinkedIn had reached out to me a couple of years ago and said, hey, we love what you're writing, long form, can you write for us? And we'll put it in our LinkedIn Healthcare Pulse. When they used to have the pulses, they no longer have them. They might be back. But what I learned in the process is a couple thousand people would read my stories, but you're not going to grow that quickly with a couple thousand followers because they're largely the same people that read your last story. It was taking a story like I saw this morning and going to Buffer or Hootsuite or going directly to LinkedIn, but I choose Buffer or Hootsuite because I know there's others that prefer Instagram, that prefer Twitter, that prefer Facebook. I don't find that to be my primary platform, but others do, and I don't want to leave them outside the stadium, as you said, right? So I go to Hootsuite or Buffer, and I share that story with all four at the same time, and I put my 2 or 3 sentences saying this is health wealth. This is realizing if you're in a small community in Iowa, and of every dollar your company spends on healthcare, 42 cents of it is leaving the market to go to an insurer in Minnesota or a pharmacy benefit manager in New York. Stop and ask yourself why, particularly because you have an unemployment problem in your community as well. Why not blow up the system and start over? That's health wealth. And so what I did this morning is I immediately forwarded it to a secondary email account, and I sit down once a week and I highlight that website. I put it in Buffer. I add my little witty comment that I know my audience will like. And I'm telling you, the best comment I get is, I know which stories to read, Josh, because I follow you on LinkedIn and you tell me if it's relevant or not. So do you know any other hacks like that, Rusty, where whether it's Hootsuite or Buffer that people can do to kind of spread their message more quickly to manage their time?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me the big thing there, Josh, is taking that work that you're doing right there and finding that article, providing the context, and going one step further. So, and I know you do this some, but especially on Twitter and increasingly on LinkedIn, when you share an article like that, assuming it's a positive share, instead of tagging the media outlet, so in other words, instead of tagging the actual corporate handle, the handles to tag is the actual journalist that wrote the article, their individual handle. And then within the article, if there are a couple of people quoted, taking the extra 5 minutes to find their individual handles or tagging their individual accounts on LinkedIn. When you do that, what happens is you pull those people to you. And what I've found is, counterintuitive as it seems to people, especially on Twitter, as counterintuitive as it seems, Twitter is actually the best place to get above the noise with journalists. A lot of people think of Twitter as the noisiest place ever. Most journalists that I talk to on a higher level are getting more than 1,000 emails a day. And those same journalists on Twitter might get 5 or 10 meaningful @replies. And in most cases are getting a push notification to their phone when they get it. And so it's a very innovative way to build peer-to-peer relationships with journalists.
Funny you mentioned that. So last Thursday, to culminate launch week for Health Wealth, is Healthcare Bankrupting Your Business, the team at Forbes and Forbes Media was nice enough to extend the private club in New York City, Forbes on Fifth, for a book launch and bestseller event and celebration for me. 2 of the 4 panelists on that panel. We had Fortune 500 company, we had a doctor, and we had 2 journalists, healthcare journalists, one from LinkedIn and one from Modern Healthcare. Both of them I met through using the hack that Rusty just shared with you, which is a great hack. It is to tag the reporter's Twitter handle and to tag those people quoted. And it turns out that I actually went to the same college as one of them as we started dialoguing. And those are the things that really, as Rusty said, get you above the fray in a very noisy social media platform. Because if you're a millennial, you might not remember this, but when I first started my career in the early 90s, email didn't even exist in some of my companies. And then by mid to late 90s, it was more of the, oh, I got excited, I just got a ping, or you remember that hokey movie, You've Got Mail? That was a big deal in the late 90s, right? Now, when you get You've Got Mail, you want to throw your laptop across the room because you hate your email, but you prefer the push notice you get on your phone that says, hey, somebody on Twitter or LinkedIn thought you were important enough to tag you. And so again, and in 5 or 10 years, that'll probably be something that's of the past too. And as Rusty mentioned with his book, which we'll get to in a second, this is why he's doing updates every couple of years on his book. But I really love that hack, and last week's panel was a really good example of that. So I'm looking at my notes. You've shared so much awesome stuff with us, Rusty, that I got so many different places to go. Let me ask you something. I remember when I studied journalism and PR, we had ethics and communication, and newspapers would have never associated paid media with placement, and they never in a million years would have taken a press release and just reprinted it almost as is, or just changed 2 or 3 words and removed the author. How much has changed? Because I've seen both of those things happen. They're almost normal now.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is most what we might call traditional, and I'll do that in air quotes, traditional media outlets, you've got fewer and fewer journalists that are tasked with covering more than ever before. They've got to fill up the newspaper. They've got to fill up the website. They've got to get the blogs written. They've got to get the podcasts out. I mean, you've got...
Which in theory has made it easier for us if we know how to deliver news, right?
No question about it. But for those journalists that are on staff, the time that they have to actually sit and interview people is gone. I mean, I remember when I started my career, we were phone pitching media, and they actually did interviews with people. So you get Fortune interested, and they'd actually call your client and do an interview. And now most major media, as you're finding out with the launch of your bestseller, they want you to write the book and they want you to write the coverage about the book. So in other words, if they're interested now, they say, hey, we'd love a 800-word article from you, or we'd love to have you write a column for us. And so the reality for most of those journalists right now is, if something is newsworthy, if they want to cover it, they're looking for the most efficient way to cover it. And so if you write a press release that's written more like an article than an advertisement, which unfortunately is the way a lot of people write press releases, if it's written and packaged like an article, you make their lives easier, because it does become something that either they can cut and paste or they can pull from heavily when they put that article together. But the other thing, again, that I'm finding more than anything else, Josh, and I know you've gotten a lot of interest with your book, is they want you to actually create the content. So in other words, if they're interested in the pitch, they want you writing the article. And the magic in that, of course, is that you control soup to nuts the message, including the call to action at the bottom.
Yeah, it's really cool stuff. And even last week, so Forbes Books issued a press release after my book hit #1 on launch day and became the #1 new release. And I remember the initial email I got said 130 media outlets have already published it. And I kind of laughed because I took a class saying that was unethical 25 years ago in college, that they would print a press release. But as you know, the newspaper is a dying existence, and it's more of an online community now. And as Rusty said, hey, why do we hire reporters if we have reporters out there that know how to deliver news? And I would say, again, we started this interview with the fact that Rusty and I were both trained to recognize news and deliver news in a packaged manner, which is why both of us, as non-millennials, so to speak, have been able to be successful on social media, something that we didn't even have when we grew up. So that's very interesting to me. I had another question tell us about your book and Mastering the New Media Landscape, Embrace the Micromedia Mindset. Tell us what your goal was. Tell us a little bit about your co-author, and tell us about your plans to updated every couple of years?
Sure, yeah. So I'll start with my co-author, Barbara Cave Henricks, great friend and colleague of mine here in Austin, Texas. Her firm, Cave Henricks Communications, one of the top business book PR firms in the country. She did the launch for Jack Welch's book. She did StrengthsFinder 2.0, a lot of big books with Gallup, including Marcus Buckingham's books over there, and just had a great, what I would call traditional media background. Started as a journalist for NBC News and brought incredible perspective to the table about what's working today, because what's actually working today, Josh, as you well know, goes back to just the core principles of journalism. So in other words, it's great content, and in whatever form that content is shared, you think like a journalist to be successful today. So again, instead of focusing on promotion, the goal is, whether it's through a podcast, through Facebook Live, through your blog, it is really to provide value to an audience. This idea of the age of micromedia for us is, in today's media landscape, every individual and every brand, whether they know it or not, is a media outlet. And most individuals, most brands do not recognize the opportunity they have to think like a media outlet and build an audience that they own. And so many people were coming to Barbara and I asking for PR, asking for social media help, but they wanted to spend all of their time and all of their money in rented media or earned media. And what we knew was that, yeah, we can go out and run a great PR campaign for you. We can build a big audience on social media. But if you don't actually own your brand online, if you don't own that impression, if you don't have the ability to build an audience that you own the connection to, in a lot of ways, we're kind of spinning our wheels with you. And so we got those questions so much that we wanted to package that up in a book and really pull everything together. As you mentioned, one reality about writing a book in the marketing space today is, man, you've got to update that thing pretty regularly. As you know, a major part of our book is really focused on just the overarching mindset around success today. And it's really rented, earned, owned media, how those three things work together, and how to think like a journalist. The specific applications or the specific platforms that we use going forward are going to change every 2 years. That's why we're updating that piece of it. But the overall mindset, the overall message of the book is, I think, pretty timeless for the new media landscape.
So Rusty brings up a point, and one of the challenges is for he and Barbara, as they decide what month after 2 years do you release it, is Twitter and LinkedIn. They change their platforms twice a year usually, and they're usually pretty drastic. And so let's talk about that for a minute. I wrote a recent story on LinkedIn called "Video Killed a LinkedIn Star." And it's right on. You cannot deny that it's right on. I was getting 20,000 views a story, and I co-wrote this article with somebody who has 60,000 followers. I have 30,000+, and neither of us have more than 1,000 views on our story. But most of my daily videos on LinkedIn that are softer content, but all relevant to healthcare affordability, are getting in the long term more than 5,000. So talk a little bit about those platform changes, and take it back to this, Rusty, because one of the main points I left your book with, and Justin, again, my Forbes book colleague, said to me as I left the day I met him, if you don't convert your rented media or your rented media on LinkedIn to owned media on drjoshluke.com, they're going to take it away from you, just like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter already did. So can you explain that to folks?
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes back to the real estate analogy that I like to use, which is, if you build an audience on a Facebook page or build an audience on a LinkedIn account, that's fantastic. I want you to do that. But when you do that, that audience is living on real estate that you don't own. And so what Facebook did in their 2013 algorithm change was the first light switch for me, where I recognized, you know what, when we're building this great audience on this Facebook page, it's awesome while it lasts, but at the point that they flipped that algorithm, which they did for the first time in 2013, they just did again 2 weeks ago, what happens is they've got their hand on the lever with how much visibility that you get to that audience, and you're beholden to the whims of that team. And so the challenge with that is that you could build this huge audience and lose access to them, or be in a position where you've got to pay to sponsor posts to get access to them. And so that's the reason for me, Josh, of always thinking about, all right, well, how do we move people off of LinkedIn, off of Facebook, off of Instagram, and get them over to a format where you can own the connection to them. So everybody that's listening, just really practically, everybody that's listening to this podcast today, I want you to do two things. Number one, if you don't own your name as a website address, go buy it. Go buy it right now. Even if you're not going to immediately build a website, go reserve it. If you've got a name that is either A, incredibly common, or B, you share it, with somebody that's famous, you're just bad luck, and you share it with somebody famous, what I want to encourage you to do is think about changing your name. So think about adding a middle initial or a middle name in there so that you've got a brand that you can fully own online. If you already have a website in place, what I want you to do is do an audit of that website and ask yourself very practically this question. Is this website more like an online brochure? In other words, am I giving people only the ability to take a really high-value jump, whether that's a free appointment with you or buying something? Or is your website set up more like a media property with a lead magnet like a quiz, like Dr. Luke has, or an assessment, or are you just really offering not much value with something like, hey, click here to join my newsletter, which as most people listening to this know, is not much of a lead magnet.
Yeah, so much great stuff, Rusty. So actually, and I shared this with you when we were spending some time a couple weeks ago, but I'm not convinced that when a Facebook or a LinkedIn or an Instagram changes their platform, I'm convinced they're only telling us what they want us to know. And a good example of that is, I look at Facebook's most recent announcement in January of 2018 and kind of go, hey, so basically what they announced is we're going to have less advertising and more of your content. Well, who doesn't want to hear that, right?
Yeah, right.
So do I believe it? I'm not so sure I do, but I'm sure you'll see some subtle tweaks that make us think it's true.
I think a lot of it's PR, Josh, but the reality is, and I think the advantage that you have and the advantage that people who think like the media have in this landscape is whatever the algorithm change is, whatever platforms may come in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, if you are building an authentic relationship with your audience, in other words, if you are building your content strategy to serve your audience, they will seek you out wherever that may be in the future. And so that's why I get really nervous when I talk to somebody who's got all of their eggs in one basket and they're gaming the system within certain platforms to get views or to get followers, because that's such a fleeting flash in the pan approach versus going to those platforms. And I'm not saying don't think smart in terms of what the algorithm's favoring, but when you build that relationship with your audience on the back of entertaining and informative content, then people are going to find you where you go going forward. In other words, they're building a relationship with you because they trust your recommendations, they trust your context, they trust your insight, and that's what travels in today's landscape, not gaming algorithms or being overly marketing in your messaging.
It's interesting you say that, because obviously I spend most of my time on LinkedIn, so I understand a lot of the hacks, and I definitely want to get as much exposure on each post as I can, but I've never been an algorithm player, and I have some friends who are, and I don't say that disrespectfully, and I don't name them, but it's really clear when you learn those tactics, they're trying to run the algorithm. And here's what I've learned the 4 or 5 times. I mean, a lot of my people say, what's the definition of viral? I don't know that there is one. But I'm always thrilled when I get 10,000 views on a long form story, because that means 10,000 people felt it was important enough to open and read because it was authentic or it was relevant to them. But I will tell you, the 3 or 4 times my short form posts have gone viral and hit 100,000 views or whatever, it was everything you just said, Rusty. It was timely, it was relevant, it was authentic. It was a combination of people that I'd already built trust with people outside the stadium kind of peering in and saying, wow, this really hit home.
Right.
And sometimes I knew it would, and sometimes I didn't. And I know on LinkedIn, one of the hacks people do, and you can tell because they go through and they comment on every single comment on their post comments. If I don't have something relevant to say to the person who commented to me, I might say thanks once in a while, but sometimes I might not at all. And so if you ever wonder why somebody likes every comment and comments on every comment on LinkedIn, it's usually an algorithm player, and that's okay. I think a lot of people do that when they're early to the game, if you will. And I will say, when you want to build your social media following, and I can speak more specifically to LinkedIn, there's this desire to want to grow so fast, and you see these hokey posts of like, hey, I hit 10,000 today. Thanks, everybody. Gosh, I hope by the time they get to 20,000, they don't have to announce that, or they're smart enough to call their friend and say, hey, can you congratulate me
Right.
on hitting 20,000?
I always encourage people to think about Twitter as the world's biggest cocktail party. And if you can kind of imagine walking in the door at this cocktail party, so getting started on Twitter, it's just like walking in the door to a big cocktail party, right? So it's just deafening noise. It's just that white noise where you can hear tons of people talking, but you can't really make out what's happening. And a lot of people think about that with their main Twitter stream. So, like, for example, I follow back most of the people that follow me. If it's not obviously a spammer, or it's not obviously, somebody just trying to sell me something. And so I've got about 5,000 people that I follow. Practically, that makes my main Twitter account unusable. It's that white noise. There's so much happening there. And so the magic on Twitter is not that white noise. It's finding the right people. And so if you think about Twitter this way, Twitter, we do exactly the same thing on Twitter that we do at a cocktail party. We circle up. Okay, so in other words, some people are talking about Texas Longhorns football. Some people are talking about the Trump tax cuts. Some people are talking about The Voice. In other words, each of these little circles within the Twitter cocktail party, infinite amount of topics. What I want to encourage people to do is to create lists within their account. So when you create a list within your account, what you do is you filter out only updates from the people on that list. So practically, it's kind of like you're creating your own circle within this cocktail party when you create a list on Twitter. For most people that we work with, Josh, we recommend kind of 3 specific lists, and I'm going to add a 4th one for your listeners as well. So list 1 is journalists. Who are the 50 to 100 most important journalists in your topic area? Put them on a list. List 2 is influencers. Who are the 50 to 100 most important influencers in your topic area? Put them on a list. 3rd category would be groups, organizations, associations, conferences, kind of collections of your target audience. I always encourage people to do a 4th list that's just more personally interesting to them. So Twitter, for a lot of people, it starts out as something they think about from a work perspective or a business perspective, and it turns, like, for me, it's the best way for me to get college football news. It's the best way for me to get practically headline news. And so I've got a few lists that speak to my different topics that I'm interested in. But when you've got lists, what happens is, instead of aimlessly wandering your way through this cocktail party, you focus on the circles of people that can actually move the needle for you and help you get a message out. For the earned media side of this, Josh, I do still think there's huge value there. The brands, like Forbes, for example. Forbes is, that magazine is the least consumed plank within the Forbes platform. And what Forbes has done really effectively is they got ahead of where things are. I mean, they were the first group to launch a public-facing website where they allowed external contributors to come in. They've really been ahead of the curve with conferences, et cetera. And so I think where we're going with that, quote-unquote traditional media is that those brands that are innovative, that reinvent themselves like Forbes has done, continue to have huge relevance going forward. And I think the relevance comes there in the recognition that it's not just this ivory tower approach to media, the way that it's been for years. It is really serving an audience on the platforms where they're interested. And so I think you hit it on the head there.
Well, and Rusty, actually, that was a great transition, because my last couple questions are gonna kind of go back towards Forbes. But when Forbes asked me to start contributing on their website through the Coaches Council, it was an honor. And what I've thought about since then, I've been on with Forbes Books Radio. I also have some contributions coming through Forbes Books on the Forbes.com platform. It really has been great to see, as somebody who kind of came up in the communication, journalism, PR ranks, to see the commitment Forbes has made. And so what I wanted to talk about next, Rusty, is the last couple questions, is you and I both had the opportunity to see Steve Forbes speak in January 2018. And what was cool about it, and Rusty was very involved with the summit, so I'm not sure how much he heard of my presentation or of Steve's, but I want to take it back to healthcare and being an entrepreneur who also has now worked in corporate America and kind of has been on both sides. From what for those of you who didn't already hear the story or read about it, I gave a presentation on health, wealth, 9 steps to financial recovery, kind of a TED Talk that Rusty mentioned earlier. And I highlighted 4 or 5 of the steps that every American can take to save yourself thousands annually, and that your corporation should be supporting you in, so their costs can come down too. The next day, when Steve Forbes spoke for an hour, he talked about finance, talked about politics, and he talked about healthcare. And sitting in the room was much of the same audience as the day prior, and I was getting high fives through the air from people saying he's hitting all the points you hit yesterday. So it was encouraging for me to hear that he said some of the things like DNA testing that can help you understand which medications work on you and which ones don't. Telehealth and remote monitoring, being willing to do that from your home or from your office, will not only speed up your ability to get to see a doctor for you or your family, but will bring your costs down significantly. Medical tourism, which, gosh, we got to find a new name for that, because the average distance people are driving to find that center of excellence that saves them thousands is only 35 miles. So Rusty, as an entrepreneur and as a father, which of these, just overhearing as you were running in circles, helping making sure that the conference went well, which of these is the one that you said, man, I got to do that. That's easy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing for me right now as a business owner is looking for creative ways to remove the insurance companies from the picture. So in other words, really in a similar way that we talk about going around the media to get directly to your audience, that kind of disruption, I mean, this is next, or we hope it's next in the health insurance space, and you're driving a big part of that. I think for me, it's how do I figure out a way to creatively go around the insurance company and get directly to the providers that can give my team, my family, my staff the best possible care at the least amount of friction from a cost and hassle standpoint. And there's innovative companies coming up in that space. Vextra Health is another one that Justin also has been talking a little bit about, that I think's got a pretty interesting model. But it's how do we remove the excess weight and friction and cost that those health insurance companies put on things, and figure out another way.
Yeah, great input. There's so much out there, and so folks, Health Wealth is healthcare bankrupting your business. 9 Steps to Financial Recovery is something that any individual could read and would take something from. In September, we'll be releasing Health-Wealth is healthcare bankrupting your family. At health-wealth.com, you can take a free loss assessment. You can find out more about the book. We're actually going to launch an interactive series here at the end of February 2018. If you want to hashtag pound health wealth, because they don't allow the dashes and the hashtags, I'll usually say pound health wealth and then put a space and say at health-wealth.com. But I think we're going to get a collection at Pound Health Wealth of hashtags that anything that can save other people money on healthcare, please share it. Because as we talked about, that's your way of taking our content and my content and building your following, putting people in your stadium by saying, hey, I'm focused on healthcare affordability as well. So I want to close with a question.
Favorite sports team's got to be the Texas Longhorns, and that game that we played against you guys in the 2005 Rose Bowl, I think most people would say best college football game of all time.
Remember that game.
Yeah, I know. I figured that might be slipped in your mind, but all about the Longhorns for me.
Cool. Yeah, and if you have never been to Austin, I've had the pleasure and honor of speaking at South by Southwest the last couple of years. It's such a neat town, and I remember being there going, gosh, it kind of feels like Berkeley, but it kind of doesn't. It kind of feels like Nashville, but it kind of doesn't, and it's really unique, and you really can't compare it to any other town. One of the neatest places I've ever been. I've been there a couple times. I'll be there again in March. I'll be there again in April of 2018. If you haven't checked it out yet, Health-Wealth is healthcare bankrupting your business. 9 Steps to Financial Recovery. Here's what it looks like. Take a look there, because as of this morning, I was notified they're going to be putting a little gold seal that says #1 Amazon bestseller on the cover for future copies. Really excited, and thank you to all of you who made that possible. I want to thank Rusty Shelton for great input on Twitter, social media hacking, truly understanding the new social media landscape. The name of his book's right on, isn't it? Understanding it. Look for an update here in the next year or so on that. Rusty, give us your Twitter handle, if you will.
Yeah, it's just at Rusty Shelton on Twitter.
Enough.
Yep.
Easy enough, and that gets back to own your name if you don't already and change your name. And I wanted to make a point on that. When I signed with Forbes to write this book, they said, hey, you know how you're joshluke.org because some young millennial artist got joshluke.com before you? And I said, yeah. They said, hey, from now on, you're Dr. Josh Luke. Stop telling people to call you Josh. So now my new speaking website is at drjoshluke.com for that exact reason. And you know what? I think I needed to hear it. as somebody who got a PhD at a young age and just wanted to be personable and said, oh, just call me Josh. I needed to hear from several people that, hey, you're an authority figure, you're a doctor. People call you Dr. Josh Luke from now on. So that was good input. And I know when Rusty said change your name, a lot of you probably chuckled, but don't chuckle. Chuckle and then go, oh, I see what he's saying. I don't have to legally change my name, but change my name to one I can start using on social media that's consistent. So again, thanks Rusty Shelton for joining us, and thank you again for tuning in to the Health Wealth Podcast and Radio Show with Dr. Josh Luke.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Health Wealth Podcast and Radio Show with Forbes author and contributor Dr. Josh Luke, America's Healthcare Affordability Authority. Visit drjoshluke.com for information on speaking appearances and other resources.